In the early morning of November 3rd, 2024, in rural Texas, 7 masked men invaded Eleanor Briggs' property, believing they'd find only a vulnerable widow, the woman who had buried her husband 45 days earlier, murdered by those same criminals. What they didn't know, and what the American press would discover later, is that Eleanor wasn't just a grieving widow. She was the daughter of one of the most legendary trackers in Texas search and rescue units, trained since childhood to identify footprints, escape patterns, and movement signs in the desert as if reading a living map. When those men crossed her fence, they didn't find fragility. They found cold calculation, lethal patience, absolute determination. In the following 3 weeks, 7 names known to police would simply disappear from reports, each case marked by a detail that would become symbolic: a buckle from her husband's belt, carefully left beside each location where one of them was found. And now I ask you, did Eleanor go too far? Or did she just do what justice refused to do? 45 days had passed since Eleanor Briggs buried her husband James in the small cemetery outside Marfa, Texas. 45 days of silence that pressed against her like physical weight, of cooking for one, of talking to empty rooms just to hear a human voice. The ranch felt enormous now. 2,000 acres that had been their dream, James's and hers, to build something away from the chaos of cities, to raise cattle under the biggest sky in America. Now it was just hers, and it felt like a prison made of memories. Eleanor tried maintaining routine like the grief counselors suggested, fed the horses, checked water tanks, drove the fence line looking for breaks. But nothing filled the void James had left. Sheriff Clayton Webb had promised action. "We know who they are, Eleanor, the Salazar crew. Been running drugs and extortion through these counties for years. But knowing and proving are different things." Empty promises. That's all she got from law enforcement. The whispers in town were worse. Those Salazar boys don't leave widows alone. She should sell and get out. Poor woman, all by herself out there. Eleanor heard it all, pretended not to, went about her business, but she visited the barn every day where James's things remained. His work hat hung on a nail, his favorite buckle, sterling silver with turquoise inlay, won at an Amarillo rodeo 20 years ago, sat on the workbench. She would hold it, trace the patterns, remember. 6 weeks after the funeral, Eleanor noticed something that changed everything. Fresh tire tracks on the service road that only someone familiar with the ranch would know. And footprints, multiple sets, heavy boots, different treads, at least 5 individuals. Someone had been scouting, planning. Eleanor crouched down, studying the impressions with eyes trained since childhood. Her father, Marcus Briggs, had spent 30 years with Texas Search and Rescue, teaching her to read what others missed. "The desert talks, baby girl," he used to say. "Every step tells you something, how fast they were moving, whether they were scared or confident. Ground don't lie." She'd learned well. By 16, police in 3 counties knew her name, but she'd set that life aside when she married James. Now, looking at those tracks, the old knowledge woke up like muscle memory. She understood 2 things with perfect clarity. They were coming for her, and she wasn't going to wait for them to make the first move. That evening, Eleanor turned off every light in the ranch house. She sat in darkness, listening to the desert night sounds. Around midnight she heard it, the distant rumble of engines approaching slowly without headlights, trying to be quiet but failing because nothing is truly silent in the desert stillness. Eleanor didn't panic, didn't call 911, didn't run. She simply stood, moved to the window, and watched as 7 masked men crossed her fence line, believing they were hunting a helpless widow. They had no idea they'd just become prey. The morning sun rose over the Texas desert with that particular brightness that makes everything look sharp and unforgiving. By 7 a.m., the temperature was already climbing toward what would be another brutal day. In the small town of Marfa, news traveled fast. It always did in places where everyone knew everyone's business, and gossip was the primary form of entertainment. Martha Hendricks, who ran the gas station on the main road, was the first to notice something strange. 3 motorcycles had been parked outside her station since the previous night. She knew they belonged to members of the Salazar crew. Everyone knew their bikes, their colors, their reputation, but the riders were nowhere to be found. Odd, she muttered to herself while opening the store. They never leave their bikes like that. By mid-morning, others were noticing. The sheriff's office received calls about abandoned vehicles on rural roads. A truck found with the engine still running, driver's door open, nobody inside. A car parked at an angle on the shoulder like someone had stopped in a hurry and never returned. Sheriff Webb drove out to investigate personally, and what he found made him uneasy. All the vehicles belonged to known associates of the Salazar gang, but there were no bodies, no blood, no signs of struggle. Just empty vehicles scattered across 20 miles of desert highway. "Where the hell did they go?" his deputy asked. Webb didn't have an answer, but he had a suspicion he wasn't ready to voice yet. Meanwhile, Eleanor went through her morning routine as if nothing had happened. She fed the horses at dawn, checked the water levels in the tanks, swept the porch. To any observer, she was just another ranch widow trying to maintain her property alone. But if someone had looked closely, really closely, they would have noticed she moved with purpose. She wasn't going through motions anymore. There was calculation in every step, awareness in every glance toward the horizon. Around noon, a neighbor named Carol Peterson drove up the dusty road to Eleanor's property, bringing a casserole she'd made as an excuse to check on the widow. Carol had known Eleanor for 15 years and considered her a friend, though they'd grown distant after James's death. When Carol reached the front gate, she stopped her truck abruptly. There was something lying on the ground right at the entrance, something that caught the sunlight and gleamed silver. A belt buckle. Ornate, distinctive, unmistakably the kind that James Briggs used to wear. Carol got out slowly, staring at the object. She knew that buckle. She'd seen James wearing it at the county fair just months before his death. The turquoise inlay, the particular pattern of the silverwork, it was unique. But why was it here, left deliberately in the middle of the entrance like a marker, like a sign? Carol looked toward the ranch house. Eleanor was on the porch, hanging laundry on a line, her movements calm and methodical. She waved when she saw Carol, a small smile on her face. "Morning, Carol. Come on in for some iced tea." The voice was normal, friendly, showed no trace of anything unusual. Carol made an excuse about being in a hurry and drove away faster than necessary, the casserole forgotten in her passenger seat. But she couldn't stop thinking about that buckle, positioned so carefully, almost ceremonially, at the entrance to Eleanor's property. By evening, word had spread through town, not just about the missing gang members, that was alarming enough, but about the strange detail that was emerging. Several people reported finding similar buckles in odd locations, one near an abandoned truck, another on a rural road, each one identical to the type James Briggs had worn. The community split in their reactions. Some felt fear of what this meant, of escalation, of violence spreading, but others, particularly those who'd been extorted or threatened by the Salazar crew for years, felt something different, relief, and a dark kind of satisfaction. Sheriff Webb sat in his office late that night studying reports and trying to connect dots he wasn't sure he wanted to connect. The buckles, the disappearances, Eleanor Briggs's ranch positioned almost exactly in the center of where everything was happening. He picked up his phone 3 times to call her and 3 times put it back down, because some things in rural Texas you learn not to see too clearly. Some forms of justice happen outside the law, and sometimes, just sometimes, That's how it has to be. Online, on local forums and Facebook groups, a new phrase started circulating: the ghost widow of Texas. Someone posted a grainy photo of a figure in the distance, barely visible in desert heat shimmer, watching from a ridge. The caption read, "She's out there and she's not finished." The post got 3,000 shares in 6 hours. One of the surviving gang members, a man named Ray, who'd been smart enough to stay away from the ranch that night, saw the post on his phone. His hand started shaking so badly he dropped the device, because that morning he'd found something outside his motel room, placed carefully on the concrete, catching the early light, a silver buckle with turquoise inlay. And he understood with absolute clarity that running wouldn't save him. Eleanor remembered the exact moment she learned to read the desert like a book. She was 12 years old, and her father had woken her before dawn on a Saturday in July. "Got a call," Marcus Briggs had said, already dressed and loading gear into his truck. "Missing hiker up near Big Bend. You're coming with me." It wasn't a request. It was training. They'd driven for 2 hours, then hiked for 3 more, her father stopping every few hundred yards to crouch down and examine the ground with an intensity that bordered on religious. "See here?" he'd said, pointing to a slight depression in the sandy soil. "Boot print, size 10, deep on the heel. Person's tired, dragging their feet. And see how it angles? They're favoring the left leg, probably twisted an ankle." Eleanor had stared at what looked like nothing, trying to see what her father saw. "The desert keeps records, baby girl," Marcus continued, moving forward slowly. "Every step is a sentence. Every disturbed rock is a word. You just gotta learn to read the language." They found the hiker 6 hours later, dehydrated and injured but alive. The man's family had been overwhelmed with gratitude, but Marcus just shrugged it off like it was nothing. On the drive home, he'd told Eleanor something she never forgot. The ground don't lie. People lie. Witnesses lie. Even evidence can lie. But the ground, it just tells you what happened. No agenda, no bias, just truth. Now, 3 decades later, Eleanor felt that knowledge surge back through her like electricity through a wire that had been dormant too long. She began tracking the remaining gang members with methodical precision, not rushing, not acting on emotion, but applying everything her father had taught her with cold, calculated efficiency. Each footprint in the dust told her a story. The deep impressions meant someone heavy or carrying weight. The dragging heel meant exhaustion or injury. The irregular spacing meant panic, loss of control, fear overwhelming rational thought. Eleanor mapped the territory in her mind exactly as her father had taught her, working in expanding circles from a central point, never in straight lines, always seeing the complete pattern before making a move. She knew where they'd go before they knew themselves. Criminals, especially frightened ones, were predictable. They sought familiar ground, places they'd used before, routes they considered safe. But familiarity created patterns, and patterns could be predicted. The buckle, James's buckle, became her signature. Not because she wanted recognition or fame, but because it served a tactical purpose her father would have appreciated. "When you're tracking dangerous prey," Marcus used to say, "sometimes the best weapon isn't a gun. It's getting inside their head. Make them afraid. Make them sloppy. Scared people make mistakes." Each buckle she left was psychological warfare. It told them she knew where they'd been. It proved she was ahead of them. It reminded them why this was happening. And most importantly, it created the kind of fear that makes people act irrationally, abandon safe patterns, expose themselves. Local media started picking up the story, though they didn't understand what they were covering. A reporter from El Paso wrote about mysterious disappearances and possible cartel violence. A blogger from Austin theorized about rival gang warfare. None of them got close to the truth. Federal agents took notice when the disappearances hit 7 within 3 weeks. An FBI analyst named Sarah Chen reviewed the case files and noticed something the local sheriff had missed: or chosen not to see. "Someone with advanced tracking skills is involved," she wrote in her preliminary report. "The precision suggests military or professional search and rescue training. This isn't random violence, this is methodical elimination." Her supervisor read the report and quietly filed it away. Some cases he'd learned in 20 years with the Bureau solved themselves in ways that didn't require federal intervention, especially when the people disappearing were themselves wanted on multiple warrants. Eleanor continued her work in silence. She didn't celebrate, didn't feel satisfaction, just moved through each day with the focus of someone completing a necessary task, the way you'd repair a fence or clear a field of stones. But she thought about James constantly, remembered his laugh, his hands, the way he'd looked at her across the kitchen table every morning for 19 years. The buckle she carried with her, the last one, the one she hadn't yet placed, was the one he'd been wearing the day they killed him. She'd keep it until the job was finished. One man remained. Ray Salazar, the one who'd been smart enough to stay away that first night, but not smart enough to leave Texas entirely. Eleanor had been tracking his movements for 4 days now, watching his patterns, understanding his psychology, waiting for the perfect moment, and that moment was coming soon, very soon. Ray Salazar made his decision on a Wednesday morning, sitting in a roach-infested motel room 40 miles outside of El Paso. He was done, finished. He'd pack his things, drain his bank account, and disappear into Mexico, where even the ghost widow, whoever the hell she really was, couldn't follow. He'd spent 3 sleepless nights jumping at every sound, checking the locks on his door compulsively, peering through the stained curtains at the parking lot below, expecting to see... what? A figure in the shadows? A woman with a rifle? He didn't even know what he was afraid of anymore, just that the fear itself was suffocating him. The buckle he'd found outside his door 3 days ago sat on the nightstand like an accusation. He'd thrown it away twice. Both times, he'd gone back and retrieved it, unable to explain why, except that leaving it felt worse than keeping it. Ray threw his few belongings into a duffel bag, checked his pistol one more time, and headed for his truck in the parking lot. The sun was barely up, the air still cool with that brief mercy before the Texas heat became unbearable. He'd drive to Juarez, disappear into the sprawl. The cartel there owed him favors from an old gun deal. He'd be safe. He had to be safe. What Ray didn't know, couldn't know, was that Eleanor had predicted this exact move 4 days earlier. She'd studied his pattern of behavior from the information she'd gathered. Ray was a coward at heart, the kind who stayed back while others did the violent work, the driver who kept the engine running while his partners committed crimes. Cowards ran, and they ran to familiar ground. Eleanor had checked his background. He'd grown up near the border, had family in Juarez, had connections to smuggling routes. When pressured, he'd run home like a wounded animal returning to its den. So Eleanor had driven to El Paso 2 days before Ray had even decided to flee. She'd positioned herself where she could observe the main highway routes, the border crossing points, the cheap motels where men like Ray hid when they were scared. And she'd waited. When Ray's truck pulled out of the Sunset Motel parking lot, heading west toward the border, Eleanor was already ahead of him, not following, leading, moving to the next point where their paths would intersect. She didn't rush, didn't need to. She knew where he was going before he did. Ray tried calling some of his old contacts as he drove, hoping someone would offer shelter or at least information. But every call went the same way. The first number rang twice before disconnecting. The second call was answered, but the voice on the other end said simply, "Can't help you, man," and hung up. The third contact, a smuggler named Luis, who Ray had known for 10 years, was more explicit. "You got that widow after you, that tracker lady. Hell no, Ray. I heard what happened to the others. I ain't getting anywhere near that." The word had spread faster than Ray had imagined possible. The ghost widow wasn't just local legend anymore. She was a reputation that traveled through criminal networks like a virus, making men who'd never been to Texas afraid of a woman they'd never met. Ray's driving became erratic. He took exits without planning, doubled back on routes, changed direction seemingly at random. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles went white. The ground beneath his tires told Eleanor everything she needed to know. When he stopped for gas, she saw the pattern of his footsteps, short, irregular, constantly turning to look behind him. When he abandoned his truck at a rest stop and tried to hitch a ride, she read his panic in the scattered cigarette butts and the way he'd paced the same 10-foot stretch of concrete for 30 minutes. He was breaking, coming apart, making mistakes. Ray eventually found shelter in a condemned building on the outskirts of a small town whose name he didn't even know. He was 20 miles from the border, but might as well have been on another planet. He had no transportation, no allies, no plan, just fear. On the morning of the 5th day, when he woke up on a floor covered in dust and broken glass, he found something that made his bladder nearly release. Sitting on the windowsill, positioned so the morning light caught it perfectly, was another buckle. Silver with turquoise inlay. Ray screamed, actually screamed like a child, the sound echoing through the empty building. She'd been here, while he slept, close enough to touch him, close enough to end it. But she hadn't, because Eleanor wasn't interested in quick violence. She wanted him to understand, to feel, to experience the same helplessness James must have felt in his final moments. Ray stumbled outside, his legs barely supporting him, and started running. No direction, no plan, just blind animal panic. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs gave out, collapsing in the red dirt of the desert that stretched infinite in every direction. And when he looked up, gasping for air, he saw her, standing on a ridge 200 yards away, just a silhouette against the rising sun, not moving, not approaching, just watching. Eleanor Briggs, the ghost widow, the hunter who'd been 3 steps ahead of him from the very beginning. 3 days after Ray Salazar was last seen, his truck was found abandoned near the Mexican border, with the keys still in the ignition and his wallet on the dashboard. Local police filed a missing persons report that would never be seriously investigated. Nobody looked very hard for Ray Salazar. Nobody asked uncomfortable questions. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor's ranch became something unexpected, a destination. Not for tourists or reporters, though many tried, but for locals who understood what had happened without needing it explained. They came quietly, usually at dawn or dusk, farmers who'd been extorted for years, shop owners who'd paid protection money they couldn't afford, families who'd lost sons to gang violence. They brought simple offerings, homemade bread, jars of preserves, flowers from their gardens, handwritten notes of gratitude they left at the gate without knocking. Eleanor found them when she did her morning rounds. She never acknowledged the gifts publicly, but she kept every note in a wooden box in her bedroom, reading them on the nights when doubt crept in about what she'd done. The media attention was inevitable. A reporter from Dallas drove out to the ranch, followed by teams from Houston and Austin. They wanted the story. The widow who'd supposedly taken justice into her own hands when the system failed her. Eleanor refused every interview request. When one particularly persistent journalist from CNN managed to reach her by phone, her response was brief and final. "I'm just a rancher trying to live in peace. If criminals decided to leave this area, that's good for everyone. But I don't know anything about it, and I'd appreciate being left alone to grieve my husband." She hung up before they could ask follow-up questions. Sheriff Webb closed the investigation into the disappearances with a report that attributed everything to gang-related activity and possible relocation to avoid rival conflicts. No charges were filed, no warrants issued. The case was marked inactive and filed away in a cabinet that nobody would open again. Webb drove past Eleanor's ranch once, slowing down but not stopping. He saw her on the porch, mending a fence post. looking like any other rural woman managing a property alone. Their eyes met briefly. He nodded. She nodded back. That was the only acknowledgement that would ever pass between them. The FBI analyst, Sarah Chen, had her report on the Texas disappearances returned with a note from her supervisor. Insufficient evidence for federal involvement. Recommend local jurisdiction handle as they see appropriate. She understood what that meant. Some cases closed themselves in ways that didn't require official intervention. Online, the legend grew. The Ghost Widow of Texas became a hashtag. Reddit threads debated whether she was real or myth. YouTube videos analyzed the timeline of disappearances. True crime podcasts dedicated episodes to the story, interviewing everyone except the one person who actually knew what happened. Some people called her a vigilante who'd gone too far. Others called her a hero who'd done what the justice system couldn't. Most people in rural Texas just called her someone who'd handled her business the way people used to before bureaucracy and red tape made justice impossible. Eleanor returned to her routine. She woke with the sun, cared for her animals, maintained her land, and lived the quiet life she and James had always wanted. But now there was peace in it, not the peace of forgetting, but the peace of completion. The last buckle, the one James had been wearing when he died, hung on the wall of her bedroom. She looked at it every morning and every night, a reminder of the man she'd loved and the debt she'd paid on his behalf. Neighbors swore they still saw her sometimes, walking the ridgelines at dawn, scanning the horizon with eyes that missed nothing. Old trackers never really stopped tracking. It's in the blood, passed down from parent to child, like genetic memory. The desert, which had witnessed everything, kept its secrets the way deserts always do. The wind covered tracks, the sun bleached evidence. The land absorbed what had happened and moved on, indifferent to human notions of justice or revenge. And Eleanor Briggs, the woman who'd proven that some debts are paid outside the law, became exactly what Texas needed. A reminder that in places where civilization's reach weakens, older rules still apply. Rules about family, about loyalty, about the kind of justice that doesn't require judges or juries, just knowledge, patience, and the willingness to do what needs doing when no one else will. The Ghost Widow of Texas had earned her name. And the desert, that ancient witness, whispered her legend to anyone who knew how to listen.